Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anu Sood, and I'm the Director of Marketing at Caseway RCM and today's moderator. I hope everyone is doing well, and we thank you for taking the time to join us. Today's webinar is called Strategies to Implement and Enhance Digital Onboarding. So the ongoing pandemic has brought new life to the topic of how digital onboarding fits into the banking ecosystem, as well as the relationship between this technology and AML compliance. So in today's presentation, we're asking the experts at Thomson Reuters to discuss their experience with recent implementations, as well as some of the myths they have encountered around digital onboarding. So our presenters today are two experts from Thomson Reuters. Charlie Heidlich is the Partnership Manager for the Clear Suite of Solutions. He is responsible for the strategy and oversight of all technical partners within the corporate investigative arm of Thomson Reuters. Now, prior to joining TR, Charlie worked for FinScan, where he was responsible for driving partnerships and building cross-disciplinary collaboration. Now, over the years, Charlie has developed an expertise in financial compliance software and has worked closely with clients solving complex problems in creative ways. He is based out of Washington, D.C., where he lives with his wife and dog, Henry. Amanda Dupont has over 23 years of experience in the legal industry. She is CAMP certified licensed attorney and practiced law in Minneapolis for over 8 years. Amanda joined Thomson Reuters in 2006 and has held roles throughout the business. Now, in her current role as public records product specialist, she works closely with corporate commercial customers to help develop innovative solutions in the public records arena. She holds a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a JD. She's based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. So with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Charlie and Amanda.
Anu, thank you so much. We very much appreciate the very nice introduction there and look forward to our conversation today. Amanda, thank you for joining me on this conversation. Today, what we're going to be touching on is the sort of concept of onboarding and how technology plays into the overall strategy within primarily digital banking, but also how financial institutions as a whole should be approaching the future and current state of onboarding in the new world that we find ourselves in. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to be talking about a handful of different topics, all on sort of a generalized focus around digital onboarding. The first point that we're going to be touching upon is ID validation and risk assessments. We're going to be talking about the government lending programs that we've seen hit the United States and have been covered quite heavily in the national news, and I'm sure have changed many of your business practices to some degree. We'll talk about digital banking in general, move on to the solutions that are available in the market itself. We're going to touch on some of the myths that prevail in the industry and bust some of those myths. And then we'll finish up with some key takeaways for the conversation today and end, of course, with question and answers. Now, I do highly recommend that you provide questions throughout the conversation today. We really love this to be as conversational as possible, understanding that we've got a pretty large audience here. So feel free to drop questions in, and our moderator will be able to pepper those into the conversations as we progress along. So the first thing that we'd like to do, Amanda and I, is talk a little bit about identity validation and risk assessments, really around how technology can fit into the process that you have today. And so what we're going to start off is by sort of defining what documentary identification validation or identity validation really is. And I'm going to throw things over to Amanda to chat a little bit about how she has seen in the industry documentary-based identity validation has really played an integral role and then also evolved into what we're seeing today.
Yeah, Charlie, you're throwing it over my way.
I am indeed.
So on this topic, I mean, I think you and I are going to just kind of have a conversation here. And Anu, we'd love questions. We for sure want to hear from the audience as we pick up this topic. But one thing we thought about, Charlie, when we were thinking about this presentation is how rapidly digital onboarding became necessary, right? I mean, if ever you needed to have a digital onboarding strategy, the year 2020 is the year. COVID changed everything. And so from our perspective, we've seen a huge move from everybody that Caseware essentially serves. When Anu was talking kind of who Alessa serves in the AML marketplace, everyone is interested in how they can onboard customers, not necessarily face-to-face anymore. And I wanted to start just by kind of level setting what we're even talking about. You know, what is digital onboarding? If you think about it, everybody, it's using your phone, your apps, you're not face-to-face banking. You're a new customer, you're coming in the door virtually, you know, you're not coming in the door physically. Are you set up to support that, really? That's the key question. We know what has traditionally happened is you're coming in with actual documents. If I'm a person, I'm showing my identification. If I'm a business, I'm, as a beneficial owner, showing my identification, and I'm also showing the business documents. But what we really want everyone to start thinking about in 2020 is you probably can get documents without a customer presenting them today, right, Charlie? I mean, that's kind of the crux of what we're here to talk about.
It really is. And one thing that I love about this conversation, you know, centered around the experience that we all are living through simultaneously of sort of the new COVID world is how it is highly reflective of other changes that are going on in our day-to-day lives. You know, although Amanda and I feel very comfortable with sort of the web call presence, we've done these types of conversations, you know, for quite a while. A lot of people had to very rapidly learn that this was how things are going to be. And I'm sure most people on the conversation, if not all, have sort of read all of the think pieces on how, you know, work from home and digital conferences are going to be, you know, at least a small part, if not a large part, of sort of the world moving forward, even after everything sort of settles back down. And from my experience working in sort of the software industry within AML and financial institutions, that has a really interesting parallel to this component specifically of working with your customers digitally. A lot of what we're talking about, some of our more conservative financial institutions have put on the back burner because they were able to. Having in-person account openings was okay because it was the way that things have always been done, and you could get away with that. You know, we kind of put some gasoline on that fire. Now, one thing that we've got up on the screen right now is a sort of common belief that it is more risky, that this is something that digital onboarding, especially, not just banking in general, but onboarding has been really primarily focused on sort of your more Wild West, whether they be fintech, whether they be emerging institutions, smaller institutions, the ones that play, you know, maybe a little bit more fast and loose with the rules. But that's not the case. It definitely isn't today, even if it may have been previously. And what we're going to see in this conversation is that there is a lot of tools that have been tried, true, and tested to be able to meet a lot of those needs that, you know, that our clients have today. So,
yeah, and one thing I think that's worth thinking about, I always am speaking at industry events, and I remind everybody best practices are very fluid, right? What worked in 1995 when I was a first-time lawyer is not what you do in 2020. And everyone in the financial institution space has to realize even what you did 5 years ago is fully that is just outdated at this point. Technology is rapidly shifting what a best practice looks like. And the question I think we'll find, and I do, so much kind of studying in this area, but it's, can you really afford not to be digitally onboarding today? I recently read, and this, whether Thomson Reuters sponsored an ACAMS survey, it was last spring, as a matter of fact, when Thomson Reuters had its survey results come out from ACAMS, and 35% of respondents answered that they were still considering RegTech solutions in their AML department, right? Can you imagine now, what is RegTech? That's when the compliance function is essentially embedded in the technology. So Charlie, you come from the sanction screening world. I mean, that is truly a tried and true automated solution at this point. But I would tell everybody here that, what's tried and true now in 2020 is doing KYC in an automated fashion too. And we'll talk to how that could look and how there's a lot of industry perspectives around kind of instantly knowing your customer, instantly validating the identity. They are who they say they are, the person or business. Technology can solve that problem for you today. And anecdotally, I just was reading in one of the financial trades online, somebody recently in this space undertook an experiment to open a bank account as a consumer, went to 12 banks. They're out of the UK, but they looked at some global banks, obviously online only banks. And I hear this every day in the conversations I'm in with every type of customer, whether they're a small community bank, whether they're a global bank, whether they're fintech, whether they're Silicon Valley, whether they're disruptors. But I hear the same theme weave in, kind of how long does it take to onboard someone? So this person found in applying for an online account through 12 particular banks, the fastest to be fully approved as a customer onboarded was 2 days. At a very large bank, and this is recent, it was 36 days. And I'm just going to tell everyone, can you really afford that type of lag when there's a customer expectation that you can do things a lot smarter and faster with technology? So I just want to plant that seed that I just don't know if anyone thinks that's acceptable. And frankly, in a COVID environment, you do have to be pretty nimble to flex to other ways to onboard customers at this point.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that, excuse me, regardless of whether or not you can, your competitors can.
Yeah.
And the fact that there is at least one institution out there that can do it in 2 days, which, to be honest, is still a pretty wide berth in terms of digitally onboarding an account, highlights that. So. Amanda, you had a pretty good segue over to our COVID world. So I want to touch on a couple of real life examples from over the summer that we saw this really highlighted. Primarily, we're going to just chat briefly about the Paycheck Protection Plan and the Main Street Lending Program, PPP and MSLP, which highlighted in front page of the daily, your daily reader terms, what this problem really is. This was taking something that we all, I think, have known is something that we needed to work on at least, and put it into a crisis mode. So Amanda, do you want to go ahead and just sort of talk a little bit about the programs themselves, make sure that we're all up to speed on those?
Sure. So let's talk about kind of how the U.S. government created programs around providing essentially some type of Band-Aid to our businesses while we saw the economy essentially go into a free fall temporarily, and at least a pause method. It all went into pause. So we saw the U.S. government launch the Paycheck Protection Program recently, and I'll say far more bumpy, the Main Street Lending Program. I think everybody by now is familiar with PPP loans, but essentially these were forgivable loans for a large swath of our employers, 500 and fewer employees. You had to have a certain threshold under a financial, we're not talking your big publicly traded companies here. And if you were able to use it to support your workforce and, things like utility, rent on your building, et cetera, this could be a forgivable loan, right, Charlie? Mm-hmm. And we suddenly saw, I mean, as someone who did a lot of studying of this program and how it launched, how our customers that we support used it, we saw something really apparent. The bigger you were did not necessarily mean the more nimble you were. If ever that was the case, it was this program. Where did I see kind of where I expected? I mean, I remember going out on a limb and saying, you know, my bet is fintech will be able to leverage this. Anyone nimble will be able to leverage this program in a way that will help a lot of mom pop businesses, not the big businesses that have big bank accounts and big relationships, right? We expect them to be able to probably call their banker and get a PPP loan. But what about the small shop down the block? That's a restaurant. I mean, you know, the business is struggling. There were two ways we saw it step in and really be successful from Thomson Reuters' vantage point. Our community banks did amazing. I'll happily share what I saw them doing as they tried to onboard all these customers. But ultimately, you couldn't take on a new customer without doing a KYC, right? And did you have the ability to know a customer who was brand new in the door? Charlie, the truth is, unless you had automation up and running, you just couldn't support it. So now that the PPP loans are fully closed, August 8th is when the program stopped. You know, and I'm just looking at my cheat sheet over here, you guys. I can't remember every number. But there were 5,460 lenders involved. 525 billion was loaned out. There were 5.2 million loans. Now, here's where it got really interesting as I started kind of slicing and dicing the data. 15 lenders did 32% of all the loans, the volume, and they took 43% of the program dollars. The top three banks, the top three lenders, and I really want to kind of focus on who did what. We saw Bank of America and JP Morgan were 1 and 2. But who was number 3? A bank a lot of people haven't heard of called Cross River. It is just one branch, right? It's an East Coast bank, but it banks fintech solutions. So something like Intuit, Cabbage. I mean, there's a host of about 30 fintechs. It's actually the bank for it. It also was offering PPP, and for it to be number 3, to have processed, gosh, what was its number? Almost 200,000 loans itself. That tells you obviously they had some automation in there, and then. If I look past those top 15 lenders, which were a lot of the big names, but smaller banks who just, you know, really could go forward. There's big banks who weren't even in that top 15, and they said things to the press, well, you know, we don't have a lot of community branches. We weren't here to support it. And yet you see this one bank could process, you know, 200,000. So when I look at something like JP Morgan Chase, who processed around 280,000, I also look at the 19 fintechs that weren't considered banks at all. They were just fintechs separate and apart from that list. And they processed almost the exact same amount as JP Morgan Chase. So what I'm trying to get to is we certainly saw it firsthand. If you could support knowing a customer day one, you could help them get a PPP loan. And that was really exciting from us from Thomson Reuters to see how to kind of support that need, that community need.
You know, I think we all sort of saw the fallout of that, you know, from the small business owner interviewed on the local news saying that they were unable to get a loan. And so you had a huge reputational hit for a lot of these institutions who ended up getting, you know, having to turn away people who this program was really built for and built around. You know, now, I mean, are we expecting that they're going to roll out the next PPP program in the next 6 months? No, not necessarily. You know, we're not really 100% convinced that the political climate's going to allow for that. But to be honest, it doesn't really matter, because this is a symptom. You know, what we saw was a very glaring, but a symptom of a problem, you know, not the cause of or, you know, reason for. So I think that what we really saw was that, and you know, Amanda had a couple of really good examples in there, is that institutions that had laid the groundwork for years, to be perfectly honest, to get to the point where they had streamlined and automated a lot of their systems, really were in a position to be able to use this program as it was initially intended. And that's really what we, want to stress on this conversation is that this is something that's a continuous process of improving the systems that you have in-house so that you're able to, both support your own clients and your future clients, but also compete in the market. I mean, this is not simply a AML or KYC or risk solution that we're talking about. These are how do you effectively do business, because there are both regulations and also risk and fraud factors that you need to be cognizant of that are inherently going to put you in a position where you're not as competitive as the guy down the street, and that's not a position you want to find yourself in.
Yeah, and I know I didn't really talk about the Main Street lending program, and there's probably a reason, everybody. There's not much lending happening under the Main Street lending program. I think only 1% of the dollars set aside by the Fed and Treasury have been used here, but that's for your bigger companies. So truthfully, there's a lot more risk to a financial institution. They're going to hold 5% of the risk. And it's really unfortunate just to see that program struggle. It just does not take off. Banks are saying they don't even want the 5% risk. You're hearing the Fed say, really do strong due diligence on these loans. They start in the millions here. I mean, they can definitely be not, but you have the opportunity to go into the multi-millions in this lending pool. And we're not seeing much activity there, Charlie. So I do think, we'll have to see the economic fallout, whether we see the government step in to provide more programs. But what it exposes is, do you have a quick way to know your customer today, right? Not how they were pre-coronavirus, not even how they were a year ago or 3 years ago, look back. You probably want a way to do a refresh. And these are ways technology with lots of players, including ourselves, probably can be partners to make sure you're getting access to kind of real-time data. So in the PPP application, let's just talk about what somebody who did it smart could do in seconds here, everyone. They could know the application process requires you to know that your business owner is not a convicted felon of fraud in the last 5 years. You have to know that the person in business is not sitting on a government excluded party list, is not currently in bankruptcy. I mean, there's just a standardized list of criteria to know. And you could have just pinged us. And again, this is just where technology is in 2020. And we could have told you, guess what? Problems on all 5 of these. As I start reading all the criminal complaints that come out, and I've actually been in some meetings with some financial institutions that might not even be their customer, they're just giving me a name of someone under indictment for the PPP loan fraud. You couldn't have seen more risk on the subjects. These are people with fraud hits and fake identities, fake companies, so much that wouldn't pass a smell test could have been instantly ascertained. And as the fraud really comes to bear, the low-hanging fruit fraud where you're buying a Lamborghini, right? We're starting to see the SARS reports around everybody with a high-end car purchase. Let's just write off SARS and see if they got a PPP loan. But the point is, you could have done with technology today an instantaneous insight look at the person or business to know these kinds of things. And we saw it leveraged and we saw where it wasn't.
Yeah, and Amanda, that's a really good point in sort of that low-hanging fruit, because this is not a conversation as to where your risk profile should be. This is not, should we be opening things up faster and just being, attempt to drink from the fire hose. This is, how do we put the right filters in place so that the guy who has bought the Lamborghini with PPP loans, previously does not do so again. And that's really where we sort of come down to, some of the concepts around what we should be doing here. How do we sort of actually do this in digital banking? And, one thing that I want to chat a little bit on this topic with you, Amanda, is the myth that in-person identity validation is less risky, and in-person KYC is less risky. Because this is something we've relied on a lot in the industry. It's been something that has been sort of one of the last tenets of in-person banking to hold fast, primarily because it only has to happen once, and it allows you to be a little bit more focused. But it also is a question of what are you really looking to identify and accomplish with that moment in time. So, on that, let's chat a little bit about sort of the in-person versus digital. Why today, especially in-person, is not exactly beneficial. Besides the fact that your mask is covering up half your face.
The thing that is funny about fraud is it's always changing. It's like technology, right? Fraud changes. We see new fraud now than we saw fraud a few years ago. And the truth is, presenting a document, right? I go in and I say I'm Amanda Dupont and I have an ID and I have my company papers, which is really, how so much happens still. It doesn't mean, right, Charlie, we talked to this, it doesn't mean they're real. As someone, a mom of a fully out of college and one currently in college, I'm constantly hearing how easy it is to get from the dark web the fake IDs until they're 21. I remember telling my son, and I saw it looks very legit. And I'm like, you have 4 states. And he's like, Mom, they make you buy them in bulk, like as if that was, the answer that he has in Minnesota.
Of course.
I mean, he's covered. But think of how easy that is, you guys. These are good IDs. Now, I know there's some authentication software to look at, kind of, is this going to pass watermarks and all the kinds of, algorithms that can check the validity of a person's identification. But here's the kicker. They are looking so real, they still might not be people. One of the PPP lender files that I looked at with someone showed he used 5 separate identities. He had created 5 synthetic identities. So, the truth is, and of course he has fraud. He was using a different social to get out of his credit issues tied to probably his main social. But this is so rampant at this point to kind of create a synthetic identity and not present yourself as a real person. You need to get to source records. That's such a key takeaway. I'm constantly telling everyone, don't believe everyone who steps in front of you. Make sure you're validating against a source of some kind, a source that's been cited to you, right? I went to the articles of incorporation for the state and I confirmed this company really exists. I didn't just take their paper. I didn't just take that document, that ID, etc. That's a huge trend we're seeing. It's so easy to create paper trail fraud at this point. You see it in business fraud all the time, just fake accounts, fake statements, fake everything. So how do you get yourself to source records becomes pretty important, I think, to root out fraud and really know a customer too.
Well, it's also important to understand that this is not an and or this is not an either or conversation.
Yeah.
Validating that a document is real is something that you want to be doing whenever you're presented with a document. Now, what is behind that document also should be validated as well. If somebody comes in and can forge a signature, you generally also want to have proof that that person, supplemental proof that that person is who they are. It's the reason that identification documentation is required at those points in time as well. And so really this is 2 sides of the same coin of how do we digitally and in person, if that's still the process that you have, validate that these documents are correct, whether they be the software that is used to compare these, whether it's the standard, UV light, making sure that the hologram is there. These exist in technology as well. So you do have the ability to digitally transform your document authentication. But then you also need to understand that because it is exceptionally easy, as Amanda's extended family has proven time and time again, to purchase, your fake driver's license that, to be legitimately honest, are very, very good. And especially on driver's licenses, can pass a lot of those checks. You then want to have that secondary check of the non-documentary identity validation. So understanding the greater picture.
Yeah, ultimately it's a risk-based approach. That's all we ever hear. I mean, it's like if we're talking AML, everyone throws out risk-based approach. But I just think today with the rampant fake that's out there, you need some insight. I mean, and we're probably going to dive into this. This might be on your next slide, Charlie. Do we want to push to that one? Yeah, this is probably where we're driving to. But I am always wondering what's coming. I mean, in my role here at my company, I get to be really tied to what we're building. I get to talk to customers all over the place, but I also can kind of tell you where the future is going from our perspective, which is my favorite part of my job by far. And for the last several years, I've been reminding everybody, you know, okay, you have a risk-based approach to your customers, to onboarding, we get it. But what if you could know instantly everything on them? And I'm not talking just scoring. Charlie and I have had conversations about this. I'm trying to tell you technology today, from my perspective, can tell you everything in a public record, right? When I was talking about those PPP loans, in a couple seconds, I could have known the fraud crimes. I could have had them spit back to me and said, there's fraud crimes, here's what they are. These are the amounts of liens and judgments this person owes currently. One includes the IRS. I mean, that's just red data. I'm not actually even having to do research. It's coming back essentially in a cover sheet of data. And that to me has changed everything because, yeah, maybe you want to validate the person's real. Maybe you want to validate the company's real against records. But wouldn't you kind of want to know what the company's NAICS code is instantly, that they have a valid Secretary of State filing, that they're in good standing, that they have a website without having to do any research? Sometimes I talk to a small community bank who doesn't think there's any other way, and I will have talked to someone who tells me the 39 websites they visit for every single customer to onboard. And the 4 hours it might take, or maybe really fast days, an hour. And when I come through and say, you know, that's probably 5 seconds to generate with a click, you know, you can see jaws drop because technology is changing how you can generate things up like that. But I just come back to how much more time you could have for the core elements of what you're needed for, right? Investigations, fraud investigations, all these kind of where we have to put our human brains to work, not in kind of confirming a person or business exists today. That shouldn't be where someone's spending 4 hours a day going to, you know, various websites across the country.
And Amanda, you allude to a really important point here, which is how you can use those data points when you are automating a solution. And, you know, if you're looking at 36 different websites, you're going to do that once when it is most vital and important. Now, Amanda was also talking about sort of the difference between scoring, so like a onboarding focused KYC approach versus supplementing a investigations approach. Both of those can happen simultaneously if you have a system that automates that data. And so you can distill down where your risk is. We're going to identify an additional, say, 1 percentage point that we want to look at. We're going to reduce 10% that we actually don't need to look at. But most importantly, now we have that, 9 out of 10 records that we want to investigate. Well, we can take that investigation process, whether it be looking at 36 websites, whether it be reviewing a 100-page report, and distill that down into a single cover sheet that's going to give you 95% of the information that you're going to need so that you can take that roadmap. And the goal here really is, while simultaneously opening up the opportunity to identify all of the possible risk that you have, how do we make every stage as efficient as possible so that core nugget at the end of your process, where you actually are going to need to put human capital resources and intensive resources into that review process, how at that point do we reduce the burdens that we're only looking at the most important information? And that's for a number of different reasons. Not only is it a waste of time, which a lot of the time it is, and not only is it become problematic in terms of the turnaround time you have on records, but you also have false positive fatigue. And so if you're looking through a large amount of information on every individual, and 99% of that is just white noise, you're going to miss the actual red flag a lot of the time, because at the end of the day, that is a human being who's doing that work. And so by having this sort of multifaceted approach to all different stages of the game allows for where you need actual human intervention to be both focused and thoughtful, but also utilized in a way that's actually constructive.
No, agreed. I think I'm just wondering what our next slide looks like. Maybe you can jump us there. Yeah, I think we were going to talk to some specific examples. And I started to kind of weave this in, right, everybody? Like, if you didn't have to go grab all that data across all those websites, or I'm just thinking of a situation just the other day. I had this customer tell me they had run, a pretty standard due diligence review on someone using any number of products that are out there today. But these are massive reports. It can be hundreds of pages long. And you have to figure that out, right? No, truthfully, this is where I want everyone to think where technology's moved you to. To Charlie's point, what if there was just kind of what I call a cheat sheet? Probably tells you something about me that I still use that term. But of the key content sets, right? Fraud-based crime, huge amounts of liens, all tied to your risk kind of tolerances. You see it up front. So instead of having to go across 300 pages of records and data, you can have instant insight. And that really has been so wonderful to see people's reaction to seeing that, right? Like they're just not having to spend all that time interpreting data. I remember one person told me, like, you just gave me 8 hours back, because it was a lot of data that was just instantly condensed down for them, Charlie. So you don't miss the needle in the haystack. It's impossible to do that. If your business is sitting on the excluded party list, it's pretty red and apparent to you that is something you don't just gloss over that. And these are all elements that technology in lots of solutions probably can leverage. I know for one, that's what we're doing over at Thomson Reuters. But the point I try to remind everybody is what you did 5 years ago, couldn't even imagine what you can do today. And one of the really exciting things that I think we want everyone to realize, and we're going to get into myths as we talk about this is not for the 3% early adopter crowd, right? This is not for someone who has a Ferrari or Lamborghini PPP car budget. We're talking, these are in the marketplace, and we really just want people to understand you probably just have to start asking more questions to see if it's an option for you.
No, I think that's incredibly important. Now, before we sort of pop ahead of this this slide, I just want to sort of highlight a couple of the different things, because this is really, although we've been sort of dancing around between end of process reviewing and individual verifications versus business verifications. At the end of the day, what this really comes down to is how can we make your process significantly more efficient, your risk profile as strong as it can possibly be, and then also how do you get into a position where you can trust yet verify? And the most important component of that equation is the verify. So, if somebody presents all of this information, it's great. It definitely highlights the fact that you've got a strong client relationship. But at the end of the day, you're going to be in the position, a very risky position, if you can't vet that information in a way that is, seamless, generally automated, and works within a timeline that your clients expect. And that timeline is shrinking. So it's important to make sure that information is quickly at your fingertips, so that you don't have to rely on a piece of paper that was photocopied 3 times and then scanned in and sent into your organization.
Well, I think it goes back to, why did that one big bank take 36 days to onboard the personal account? And the reality was lots of papers got pushed back. And I constantly remind people, how do we even communicate anymore? It's, we're not sending faxes. You're typically not mailing. I mean, these are not truly the fastest ways to communicate with a customer. Chances are it's through platforms. And so just this process of constantly having to update and produce documents back and forth. One thing that's interesting in the financial institution space is we're very loyal to who we end up with. The average relationship, they say, is like 17 years. It's longer than many couples are together, your relationship with who you bank with. And you want that first experience probably to be as smart, as frictionless as it can be today. And I just don't think you can afford to be thinking, until they attach and upload the following 10 documents, we can't move forward today. You really could be making sure that doesn't have to be the case. And now, does it work for every customer? Does it work everywhere? No, but one of the biggest questions I get, Charlie, you're in a lot of the meetings I'm in, is how do we even solve international identity verification, international businesses? Truthfully, it is so much more available through technology tools than it's ever been. So it's just a good time for anyone listening in on this particular webinar to be thinking, have I started asking the right questions? Do I have a software solution that lets me essentially build in an automation to onboarding? And is it becoming what a customer expects in 2020, whether they're a person or business? But do I have controls in place to meet my regulatory compliance as well as, my fraud vetting controls? These are all critical questions that everybody essentially needs to be asking themselves at this point. Because if 2020 wasn't the year you thought you needed it, I wish I could say I think COVID's a once in a lifetime event. But hearing after you learn kind of the random bugs that come out of nowhere, who knows? So we all have to be ready for whatever the future holds. And Charlie, one last thing I wanted to share. It's just a thought I heard the other day. It's, this concept, when the future arrives, do you even recognize it? Do we? It's pretty rare that you see something like, I still remember when I saw the iPod commercial in 2001. I remember I wanted that iPod. I remember seeing the first iPhone ad, but it's not very often you kind of think, this is the future, what I'm seeing. It slowly just kind of catches up to where, it's just accepted. I was thinking back with my husband when we first had our first place so many eons ago, decades ago. And I was saying, there was a picture of us moving a TV, which by the way was a cutting edge TV circa 94. That thing was like a refrigerator. It was so heavy. Now you could, pick up a TV with your one arm and it could be as big as your room. It feels like they weigh nothing. But the point I'm getting at is technology can move so fast, you don't recognize how much it's changed. It's hard to stay in front of it. It's not like you think the future's just sitting there. So the future, from my perspective, is realizing you likely want a vendor, especially those of you who are not the biggest banks that exist in the globe. You want plug and play technology where you're not needing an IT team to build it. You're not dedicating full-time staff to manning it. This is also where things are getting. It's kind of like the light TV, right? Should you have to do so much to have an automated solution, Charlie? I think you and I talk about this all the time. It should not be the hardest challenge an AML department's faced with anymore.
No, I love the analogy to sort of the relationship. The more clients stay with their financial institution than some relationships, and it's important for when you're looking at your technology to also take some monthly date nights. Continue the relationship with your vendor, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to just sort of buy something every month because they keep harping on your email. But it's important to stay up to date with what is available and what is expected, because you don't want to find yourself in a position where you feel like you've invested too much time, energy, and money into a relationship that is just not working for you. And part of what that requires is working on yourself a little bit, if you will. And so making sure that you're taking that time. You can call it your
I feel like you're speaking from experience, but no judgment.
It's important to focus on yourself. But I do think that, I mean, to be honest, I think that the 300-400 plus people on the conversation today are a step ahead of where most people are, because you are engaged in this conversation. You're taking the time to learn about what is available in the industry. You're taking the time to understand how can we potentially leverage things that our vendors and our technology out in the market can do for us. And it's important to just sort of stay on top of that. And you don't want to find yourself sort of hit by the tidal wave of something like COVID and realize, oh, I am farther back than I thought I was. And that's really sort of at its core what we're chatting about today is constantly take stock of, is what I'm doing the most and the best of what I can do. Because one thing that's really important to understand, and we're sort of chatting about that as we come up on some of the myths that we've got in the system, or myths in the industry, is oh, this technology is something that we can't afford, or we don't have the time and the resources to be able to implement something like this. That may have been true a year ago, 5 years ago. When was the last time that you looked at that? Because just as, although Amanda, I know that your iPhone might be from 2006, most people keep their technology personally pretty well up to date. And you do realize that if you're using a Nike flip phone, that that might be doing what you want it to do. But if somebody else is going to look at that from the outside, they say, oh, well, it doesn't meet my needs. And that's when you realize, oh, the change to get up to where we need to be is now going to be monumental. And so, at the end of the day, honestly, it's more expensive not to do something.
Well, I think there's a comment that's come in, Amanda, around that, which I think maybe is worth addressing. Is so one person said, they agree that having the right solution will solve a ton of issues, but most banks will not spend the money when things are fine for now. So what do you say to something like that?
That is this is where when we were talking about kind of, do you get to have that long relationship? What if, the one thing I can tell everybody is I see a lot of shopping, forum shopping, I call it. It's not just you. They're going to 3 other places and they're going to pick one. It for sure is the case in commercial finance. It's not just you. It's kind of like speed dating if we stay with our, we seem to have picked a relationship theme for our banking world today. But so the point is, you're in a competitive disadvantage day one if you're not up to par, right? You're just not up to par. So how do you get that kind of competitive edge is making sure, we can't afford to take 36 days. We can't afford to take 60 days to get this business onboarded, because it could go to that fintech, right? Remember I said fintech has been knocking on the door. They're applying to be banks. They're everywhere. They can do it instantly. And truthfully, as I look at my kids who would never think of walking in a bank, they don't care if the bank's digital only. They really don't. So I can't imagine not thinking the competitive pressures of just what it takes to be at kind of a baseline where everybody's at today. It requires probably looking at things in a fresh way, for sure. Down from your C-level to your board, these conversations are happening.
And coming from my experience working with technology teams within financial institutions, something to make sure that you're keeping in mind is generally things are not fine. There is always something that can be improved, and just because it's technically working does not mean that the status quo is a good position to be in. I've walked into too many systems that are held together by rubber bands, Band-Aids, and bubble gum. And, the amount of time, energy, resources, and money that are being spent maintaining a system that is behind the times is astronomical. And the question comes down to, are we going to go through very painful changes every 10 years, or are we going to slowly and methodically and consistently keep up with where we should be on an annual or biannual basis?
One thing to point out, I think, as all of us, see change happening more often, right? It's almost so constant, it's hard to keep up with, right? We really can't keep up with how much changes. The good takeaway, my point here, everybody, is you should be thinking of some key questions. Is it easy to use? Do I need a full IT team? Because the truth is, it's not easy to use. And if you need full IT teams, or if a paid consultant has a paid custom solution for everything, right? There's nothing that doesn't require bespoke custom builds. These are not the realities in 2020. They should be easy to use. It shouldn't require full tech resources. You should have plug and play options. So even at the smallest end of the market, where I absolutely see the most growth for sure, because they can be so much more nimble, it isn't as painful as you think to change, because change in the old day meant change management, every single person learning new programs. I mean, we've all seen it. But, getting a new phone today, Charlie, and no, I'm not on an old iPhone. I'm on whatever Thomson Reuters supplies me, by the way. But they don't actually let me get the latest and greatest. But it's pretty seamless, right? You turn it on, you know how to do it. So things are getting easier as we go through so much change.
No, that's an excellent point. What used to be, hours spent at the cell phone store, and then have to re-put in all your old contacts into your new phone, now is a 15-minute automated switchover. And so it's once again understanding what your solutions, what your vendors can do for you today. So we've got up right now on our screen some key takeaways. This will be available after the conversation, but Anu, I want to sort of default. I know that we're coming up on an hour, and I want to make sure that we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been a few questions that have come in. So one of the first ones that came in is, how do we mitigate the risk of identity theft in instances where we don't do face-to-face validation of who is submitting the documents?
Really important question, everybody, right? Because there's kind of 2 points to identity today. Is the person real, right? Is the person real? Obviously, step one, does this person exist? Because I see the fakes all day. Step two, is that person even presenting to me? That's definitely a technology challenge, and there's a lot of really good solutions. There's so much to kind of answer that authentication question. Is this customer even presenting this data? So you need a two-prong approach, Charlie. I think we talk about this all the time and kind of how we sit in there, but do you have any further thoughts yourself there?
No, I mean, I think is the document authentic, and is the person who they say they are?
Yeah.
And one of those answers can be yes and the other no, and that means the entire equation is off for you.
Okay. And so a follow-up question was, what are some good and credible digital sources to use to verify a person's ID?
Yeah, I can definitely take this. Today, you should be able to talk to vendors and say, what's your ID verification menu of options? Just ask, what's the menu? In our case, we have a global directory of people, right? Globally, we can tell you globally if they register into a public records database across the globe. We can do the same thing with a company globally. So you really just probably want to know the menu of items, whether it's their credit bureau data, utility records, there's ID records. I mean, the list kind of goes on, but you should be able to talk to vendors and really help solve the non-documentary component today, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to not just one single end source of data. It is a myriad of number of data points. And then it is also the absence of those data points. Because as Amanda was mentioning, if somebody comes through and they are completely clean and there's nothing on this individual, that is just as much of a red flag as every fraud charge in the world.
Okay.
You know,
so
and one other thing I just point out that I hear a lot is, you know, you are not required to authenticate every piece of data of someone's PII. I get asked it over and over again. You need to make a reasonable based belief that that person is who they say they are, they're presenting to you. And there's lots of ways technology can help solve that. But I constantly get into someone saying, I need the California driver's license number fully verified. And I'm like, you actually have to validate through CIP. I know the reg, people. You don't have to validate the California driver's license number, but you want to be able to prove that person's real and true and in front of you. And technology really can help that. So if everybody understands that's what they're getting presented with, they'll have so much easier ways to bring in onboarding through, you know, technology like we're talking about. Like, you know, I know in Alessa's perspective, you know, there is plug and play technology like this sitting there. But that's the case with a lot of AML at this point, that you could turn on components like this.
So you hit the point about fraud, and this is just going to be the final question. So one person asked that, you know, it seems to be fraud seems to be the biggest problem that you're addressing with digital onboarding, but what about AML and CFT risk?
I see them all simultaneously as the same. So from an AML perspective, you could do screening. I mean, Charlie, pick up the conversation. Screening's been around for so long to kind of confirm someone's not a bad actor sitting on a bad actor list.
And to be honest, this is talking about all of the various different components of AML in, you know, different names for the same thing. In order for your screening, your sanction screening, or you know, denied party screening to be effective, you have to know who your actual person is. In order to verify that they are not a risky person, you need to be able to verify who they are. If you can establish who they are, then it gives you the opportunity to actually dig into that. So it's really looking at all of these different components of AML that mesh together really well. So if you know your customer, then you can identify properly your fraud risk. And, you know, with those two pieces in place, you can screen effectively against, you know, people you're not allowed to do business with. So it really ends up being an integral leg of the stool, but they're all very, very closely connected.
I agree.
And many times they happen instantly day one, all three steps right there, right when the name presents.
So before I conclude the presentation, I'd like to thank Charlie and Amanda for the presentation. I enjoy working with these guys, and they're very, very knowledgeable. I recommend that you reach out and ask these questions to figure out how digital onboarding can fit into your process, and how can you take what you've got right now and grow it. So thank you very much for a very insightful and fun presentation, and thank you again for Nicole in the background, who is always making sure that everything is happening just so. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.